Welcome, welcome. This is Kim Addis from Frame of Mind Coaching, and I am the host of Resilience Radio, where I interview professionals and leaders who are experts at crushing the tough stuff. Before I introduce my guest, I want to offer you a journaling question for you to contemplate, write about, and send to me. I often talk about the concept of having your crown jewels. What are your crown jewels? Your crown jewels are essentially the way you think, the way you feel, your attitude, your mood, your disposition. And very often we wake up and right away we're not in a good mood, or we have an interaction with someone and boom, something sends us into a spiral. So the question of today is, where are you not protecting your crown jewels? What are you using as your excuse to go into that spiral? So send me your journal. It's kim@frameofmindcoaching.com. And what I'm going to do with that journal is send it to one of my top team members and have them reach out to you and set up a time to discuss that with you. So go for it. Today, my guest is Jim Estill. Jim Estill is the president and CEO of Danby Appliances. That is a Canadian company and quite a large one at that. He is a Canadian technology entrepreneur, an executive, and a philanthropist. Jim started a computer distribution business from the trunk of his car while in university, which grew into a company doing $350 million in sales before selling that company to Synnex. Jim became CEO of Synnex Canada and grew sales from $800 million to $2 billion over 5 years. Jim Estill is active on various boards and was a founding member of BlackBerry, a board member of BlackBerry. Recently, Jim Estill has been making news for his sponsorship of 62 Syrian refugee families. The BBC News, The Guardian, and Toronto Life have all covered his story. Jim regularly blogs about leadership and time management at jimestill.com. In 2017, Jim was awarded the Order of Ontario, the province's highest honor, and an Everyday Heroes Award by the Globe Hope Coalition. In 2018, Jim was awarded the Order of Canada. Holy smokes, Jim, welcome.
Thank you.
So you have a tall order to fill here. I mean, we have a lot to discuss. I want to discuss all of it, but I really want to start out with this concept of starting your company out of the trunk of your car. How did that work? What were you selling? And how did you even have the gumption to do that?
Well, it was one of those things. I was too young to know better. And I was an engineer, or was just graduating as an engineer. I needed a computer, got a better deal if I bought two of them. So I bought two and sold one. And then I bought another two. And then someone needed a printer. So I bought a printer. And then I bought a modem. Then I bought some software. And pretty soon I'm buying and selling computer hardware, software, and peripherals. And that became my business.
So you said you were too young to know better. How old were you?
I would have been 22 at the time.
Wow. And so when you say out of the back of your car, it sounds like literally you're hitting the road and looking for people to buy your stuff. Where did you find the people who were interested in buying your stuff?
Well, part of it was being right place, right time. So I was just at the advent of the personal computer. And so I would go to PC user groups. I would go to student dorms. And the reason this legend about trunk of the car came up is I lived in a student residence, and the safest place for my, at that time, very expensive computer parts was the trunk of my car, because it's not like an open student dorm room. And so that was how I did it. But it wasn't like I was standing on the side of the road. I'd go into a business and, try to tell them you don't need to pay expensive mainframe fees. You can do this on a microcomputer, or else I'd find the hobbyists and the user groups, the people who were early adopting at that time.
So I'm interested because, nowadays sales have changed. It's not so much knocking on doors. It's not so much doing your individual pitch. But what was it like at the time? Was it literally walking into an office and saying, hey, can I speak to your person in charge of buying computers? Like, how did it work?
Theoretically, it would work that way, except nobody was buying the computers that I sold. So you don't go and say, who's buying the computers? You would rather go and say, have you ever seen a spreadsheet? Let me show you what we can do on a spreadsheet. You do projections. So it was more looking at what problem you could solve. And back then, people would say, wow, I was using a calculator to do all this stuff. I could only do one scenario. And you'd show someone, we'll change your gross margin from 28 to 29% and see what the numbers are with a hit and a button. The same thing with word processing. People were not blown away with it, but they were impressed that they didn't have to retype a letter or put whiteout in and stuff like that. But I'm telling you basically how old I am. Like, I'm old.
So essentially, and I don't think the rules have changed all that much, you weren't selling the product, you were selling the solution to a problem.
Exactly.
Okay. So I think that's very important. And then at some point, you decided to sell your company to Synex. So what was the driver of that? Why do that? You were doing super well. What was the point?
Part of it was entrepreneurial fear. So I had had a really good long run. I had 99 consecutive quarters of profit. And you're always worried, what's going to happen next? So there's a fear factor that partly caused me to sell. And at the same time, I wanted to grow and do other things. So that gave me, I had a 5-year stint essentially in corporate life running Synex Canada. I had a boss in California, but they didn't exactly bother me because they're in a completely different place. And
so go back. I mean, I'm interviewing you, a highly accomplished entrepreneur. You had 99 consecutive, seasons, quarters?
Quarters of profit.
Quarters of profit. And you had fear? How does that make any sense?
I think all entrepreneurs have to have fear. And fear is actually a bigger driver than the pleasure. And so
what was your fear?
Well, your fear is the big guys. Because at the time, I was a fairly small Canadian-based computer distributor. There were many international distributors coming to the market. My competitors were doing much more sales than I was doing. And I was doing $350 million in sales, but I had one competitor was doing $2 billion in my market. Another one was doing $1 billion in my market. And so you're the little guy, and you feel that you could get crushed by them. So, and for what it's worth, every entrepreneur should have some fear. Like, if you just think that you've arrived, then you'll go bankrupt. It doesn't work that way.
So what is healthy fear? Because, in my industry as a coach, I come across a lot of entrepreneurs who have fear, and that fear is paralyzing. It prevents them from taking action. It prevents them from taking risk. It prevents them from hiring the right people or making the right move or even picking up the phone to call someone who could be an amazing resource for them. So what kind of fear is healthy?
So fear that's healthy, it's like worry is not good, but if there's a fear that causes me to act, then it's a good fear. Mm-hmm. And so fear is good. I mean, fear is why you don't fall off your roof, because you're afraid, so you hold on. And the same thing is true in business. To have a healthy fear that your competitors are coming to get you, then you're going to have to figure out, well, how are you going to get around when the competitors come to get you? And so I spend my whole life figuring out what's my competitive advantage and what's my competitive disadvantage and how are other people going to do it. But you're right, it's a balance, because if you get too much fear and get into paralysis, that's when you have to say, no, this has become unhealthy fear. And the same thing is true of worry. So if I stay up at night worrying, you have to ask yourself, is that constructive? Does that help? If it doesn't help, now it could be constructive if I stay up and I'm writing a marketing plan, if I'm engaged. If I'm just staying up worried, it doesn't help at all.
Have you, in the course of your career, stayed up worried? Have you, in the course of your career, experienced paralysis due to fear?
Yes to both questions. So I have sometimes lost sleep, and I've tried to analyze it and figure out that it doesn't help me to lose sleep. So then it helps me to get back and sleep. And the things that have caused me to lose sleep are the things that I feel are out of my control. You sell a lot of product to a customer and they don't pay their bill. Or things that you feel are patently unfair. It's unfair that, I did my end of the bargain and then I didn't get paid. So that's the unhealthy side. As far as paralysis go, it happens even at a micro level. Like, I have a to-do list. My to-do list maybe has 40 items on it, 30 items on it. So I take a blank piece of paper and put the 3 items on that I want to work on. Because if I sit and stare at 40 items, it can be too paralyzing, as you say, because I'll never get through my 40 items. I've got 3 items. That's all I have to do today. That's 3 items. I'll get through that, and eventually I'll get through everything else on the list.
So, and there's another way of saying that, which could be prioritization. But how do you get out of that worry place where you're staying up at night and a big client isn't paying you? How do you switch? I'm really interested in how people use the term trade up their thinking. So they go from worry to maybe just annoyance, for example. How do you get there? How have you done that?
what I ask myself is, does this worry help? Mm-hmm. And if the answer comes back, no, this doesn't help, then you also have to say, well, what is the outcome that I'm trying for? So I can't get the company that didn't pay their bill to pay their bill, but I can still make the same amount of money by selling another $10 million over to someone else. Now, that is positive reaction to the worry. And so I try to change it. And the other thing is, it's easy for me to say and say, oh, gee, Jim's so perfect at it. I'm not perfect at it. I try, is what I'm saying. And part of it is logic. If I'm sitting up at 2:00 at night, just rerunning things through my mind, I just say, like, how stupid am I? That's crazy. Sometimes I exercise. That also can, hard exercise. It's tough to worry while you're exercising hard.
So I want to go back to something you just said. You probably don't realize that it was a big statement. Oh, I'll just sell another $10 million worth of product to someone. And all of us who are listening on this side of the podcast are going, how do I just sell $10 million of product to anyone? Forget about someone. How do I, help me do it once? So what's your advice on that?
Well, your scale changes as you grow. So at one time, I would have said, how do I sell another $1 million? At one time, I would have said, how do I sell another 100,000? At one time, I would have said, how do you sell another 10,000? Right. But at some point, I don't move the needle. I mean, yes, I'd love to sell $10,000, but that doesn't move the needle. That doesn't even pay for my rent for the day. It doesn't pay my staff for a minute probably. So I look at, where do I have competitive advantage? And then it's the entrepreneurial question. What's the best way to spend my time and resources to maximize that? And there's no right answer for any company, all answers for different companies. So do I spend the time marketing, or do I spend the time selling, or do I spend the time manufacturing, or do I spend the time doing R&D, or do I spend, you've got lots of choices. Do I go to the trade show, or do I stay home and write the marketing plan?
Is there a way that you have used to make those decisions? How do we know what the best use of our time is?
Largely for me, I try to figure out what my priorities are, and then work on those priorities, because I find that 80% of my time is actually not on my priority stuff. As a matter of fact, I do sometimes come into the office and spend all day just doing some email, have a few meetings, have a few phone calls, and then I didn't get anything done on anything that's a priority to speak of.
Even you do that?
Even I do that. Yes, I do.
Okay. It's interesting.
But if I know my priorities, what are the 3 things I want to accomplish today? And usually I put down 3 things, I get them done. And often I get the 3 things done, then I start doing more. It sort of builds me momentum. And I ask myself, what would I like to have accomplished by the end of the day? And usually I get it done.
Okay. If you go back, one of the things that you said was, if I figure out what my key competitive advantage is, what has been yours over the years? In my businesses, it's always been tiny, micro competitive advantages. So it's not like I have one huge competitive advantage. BlackBerry had one huge competitive advantage. They invented a smartphone. So that was a huge competitive advantage. But my business, I'm selling just like everybody else is selling. So one competitive advantage I had was fairly low overhead. Another competitive advantage that I had when I was small is I was small. My competitors are big. I like being a big distance from my competitors. Even now, you say my company's big. It's not that big. We do about $400 million in sales. And my big competitors, Haier and GE, Whirlpool, they're $10 billion. Well, the advantage is, the competitive advantage, I can take a small order. Like if you came to me with $1 million order, I'll send the A-team, or a $5 million order. What's a big company going to do? $10 billion company. Well, they'll send an intern, or they don't even want to tool it up. I'll make you bar fridges pink if that's what you want, because I'm small. So size can be a competitive advantage. I've always had competitive advantages around marketing, because I do a lot of guerrilla marketing, and that's always served me fairly well. So for people who don't know what guerrilla marketing is, how do you describe that in your industry? In my industry, basically, it's getting your name out, your products known, without spending as much as your competitors. So I could take out an advertisement on the television and spend $1 million, or at the Super Bowl and spend $100 million, or I could do this podcast with you and repeat Danby Appliances 100 times, if you know what I mean. Right. And it gets the name out. And this is a form of guerrilla marketing. Got it. So let's go to Danby Appliances, because we want to say Danby a few more times. Exactly. And why did you go from computers to Danby Appliances? How did you make that leap?
Well, I had retired and moved to New York, was doing angel capital and venture capital, but I wasn't finding it fully fulfilling. And my dad got sick, so I moved back to Canada, and I happened to sit on the board of a few companies. One of them was Danby Appliances. The CEO resigned, and I said, I can come in and run it as an interim. And then I said, I like operating a company. And then the ownership group said they wanted me to sell it. And I said, how much for? And they told me, and I said, okay, I'll take it. So I bought the company. And then if I look at competitive advantages, I am trying to apply what I learned in the technology business to a fairly non-technical business, shortening the cycle, doing some lean stuff. And now, of course, technology is moving into appliances. So that's how I ended up with Danby. And I like this size. 400 million is a perfect size for me because I've gone, from 350 to a couple of billion. So, and there's not that many people have done that type of scaling. There's tons of people who've done 0 to 10 million and 10 to 50 and stuff like that.
So when you look at leadership, because I know that's a sweet spot of yours, what's the biggest mistake that leaders tend to make in trying to scale their businesses?
The biggest mistake people make is micromanagement, because micromanagement inherently is not scalable. And that's, in my opinion, the biggest mistake. I also am a big believer in servant leadership. So if you want to know what I do at Danby, the answer is I don't do anything. People do everything. So everyone says, Jim, you did a great job at Danby. Yeah, that's great. Well, I didn't do anything. Everyone else does everything.
Right. So which leads us to, you sponsored 62 Syrian refugee families. So what made that a cause for you that you connected with? And was it related to Danby or was it an individual activity?
I have this theory on wealth that if you have a certain amount of wealth for security and working capital, then you should give away everything beyond that. So I have this budget for charity and I give it away. And I looked at the size of Guelph, this little community we're in, which is about 130,000, and said, well, how many people should I bring in? And you see, I saw the crisis happening. How many people is reasonable? I said, bring in 250 people, 50 families. And then people made a big deal of it. And people don't make a big deal of it when you donate money to put a roof on the hospice or start the soup kitchen or donate to Salvation Army, but they made a big deal of this Syrian thing.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think there was such a vast difference?
Well, I think there's a few things. For starters, you have to be public when you do the Syrian thing because the systems were not set up. So I set up a system where we have a director of housing, a director of education, a director of health, director of jobs, director of mentorship, and every family that comes in gets 5 mentor families, and the mentor families have checklists and scorecards. It's set up like a business. So the checklist is, get a bank account, get a bus pass, ride the bus with them, register the kids in school, get a license, do all the stuff that's needed to be done. Plus, we do scorecarding. So every 2 weeks, how's the family doing? And, this family needs more ESL, and this family's not happy with their job, and blah, blah, blah. And so I set up the systems. I also defined up front what success is. Success is people working, speaking English with some degree of integration. And once you have that as your definition, then you focus on getting people working and self-supporting. I didn't think it was good for Canada or the world to bring in there is a humanitarian reason to get people out of a war zone.
Right.
Yes. But the bigger cause, in my belief, is get them not only out of the war zone, but get them productively employed so that they can feed their family and be contributing members of society. It doesn't sure help Canada if we bring in a bunch of people that go on welfare. It would also breed resentment in the population.
Right.
So that's how that happened.
Did you get personally involved with any of these families? Like, did you meet them personally? Did you hire any of them to work at Danby?
Oh, yeah, of course. I know all of them. Oh. And I picked up a number of them at the airport, and on Saturday and Sunday, I just go from house to house and drink a lot of tea. It's a good thing they don't drink wine, or I'd have to have a driver. And so, yes, I did a lot of it, and I know a lot of it. But again, I had 800 volunteers. So it's the same as running Danby. I don't do anything. I've got all the volunteers that do everything. Yes, I go drink tea with big deal, and I do pick them up at the airport sometimes. And sometimes I have to make phone calls. So when they're living in one school district, but they're going to move in 2 months to a different school district, I have to convince the future school district, you got to take them now because you don't want the kids to move schools, and it's not in the regulations, but come on, guys, let's get it happen. And I do a lot of that. Same thing with referring people to work. So you asked, did I hire anybody? At first, I wasn't going to because I didn't want to get accused of bringing in slave labor. But then I saw that people needed some Canadianization. So we had a program we started here called Ease into Canada, where we had a 90-day program focused on ESL with English word of the day and English lunch buddies and English training coach and ESL classes. And I hired any refugee that came in, whether I sponsored them or government sponsored or church group sponsored. And I think we put almost 200 people through that program. Wow. And I currently have 31 refugees working here.
So what was the biggest lesson you learned drinking tea on Sundays?
That learning English is much tougher to do than I had thought. It is very hard to learn English. And I had originally thought that everybody would learn English fairly reasonably easily. So that's been the biggest lesson. Now, the other thing that this has taught me, though, this is a real secret. I have learned the secret to happiness. And the secret to happiness is being grateful for what you have, not ungrateful for what you've lost, not ungrateful for what other people have. And if you think of it that way, that's huge.
And you learn this lesson by observing these people, by interacting with these people, or you just learned it along your journey?
By observing this, because I would see which Syrian family is happy. The ones that are happy are the ones that are grateful for what they have, not ungrateful for what they've lost. Because if this happened to you and you lost your livelihood, you can no longer do podcasts because you don't speak the language well enough and you can't do the technical stuff. So now you have to work in a factory or cutting grass or whatever. You could be ungrateful for what you've lost.
Right. You could feel resentful, potentially.
You could feel resentful because it wasn't your fault. You didn't start the war. You didn't want the war. And on top of that, what you've lost, you may have lost your brother or your husband or your kids.
Right.
So you've seen a lot. And the other part of being grateful is not being ungrateful for what other people have. And I even see that in my employees, that some people are ungrateful that someone has a nicer car than they do. Or
is that ungrateful or jealous?
Okay, jealous then. Jealous. Okay. They're jealous, but sometimes it's just a lack of gratitude because, they've got a car and we can all be grateful that we live in pretty safe places. And I don't think you're going to be hungry tonight. We have a pretty good life. If I have problems, they're first world problems. Like I have a really bad problem because I missed the light on the way to work. It took me an extra minute. I can't believe how bad my life is.
Right. Okay. So I want to do two things. I want to, what was it like to get the Order of Canada award?
Well, those awards are very humbling. And I mean, I'm not a big guy on pomp and ceremony and stuff, but it is just humbling to get that award because and partly it's a little bit weird. Our company slogan is do the right thing. And I feel that I'm getting awards for just doing the right thing. And this is just what normal, decent people should do, is just do the right thing. And then you go and give someone an award. It's like, okay, you come and visit me. You don't steal the silverware, then I'll give you an award. Like, come on, just do the right thing.
Right. So you feel it's a little misplaced. It's a little odd.
It's a little odd. It's just like the press. I didn't originally like the press on the Syrian thing, but after a while, I didn't mind it because it gave me leverage so I can make phone calls to get things done. And I'm not shy. So I go to an event and I meet the CEO of Adidas and I say, I sponsored these Syrian refugees. Can you send me a bunch of shoes? Sure enough, he sends me a bunch of shoes. I wouldn't have been able to do that had I not had the power of the press. And to some extent, Order of Canada is the same thing. When I have an issue that needs to be dealt with, people will return my call sometimes.
So did you have that before? Because in order to grow a company that large, you have to have some degree of boldness, let's call it.
I did have some of that before, but I've become more bold. And I've also learned it's very easy to be bold when you're asking for someone else. Mm-hmm. It's not as easy to be bold when you're asking for you. Mm-hmm. So when I was just running my own business, it's tough. It's sort of weird to say, can you help me for free? But when I say, can you help me for free, help these other people, then people say yes, because I'm not asking to borrow their truck to move my stuff. I'm asking them to borrow their truck to move something else, right?
Well, because they look down and they see that you have pretty nice shoes already, right?
Exactly.
Okay. I want to go to something else. I want to look at your life and your accomplishments and look at what motivated you, what inspired you. Was there someone in your life that acted as a mentor or a coach or a driver for you?
I have lots of mentors. And some of these people don't even know they're my mentors. I choose mentors for different areas. So some mentors are mentors scaling business in sales, and some mentors are marketing mentors, and some are manufacturing mentors, and some are personal development mentors. and personal training mentors. So I have lots and lots and lots. As far as any major inspirations, Frank Hasenfratz from Linamar Machines was on my board for 10 years, and he has been a great inspiration. And he started a car parts manufacturer from zero. And this is a funny story. He was a refugee. And when he came to Canada, he lived in the train station for 2 weeks. Then he migrated to Guelph, and he worked at Danby Appliances for a year and a half. And then he said to Danby Appliances, how much do you pay for this little bracket? And they said, oh, we pay $2. He said, well, if I could do it for $1.50, would you buy it from me? He went and bought a machine, started making brackets for Danby Appliances, and now he's got a $10 billion car parts company with 10,000 employees.
And he sells product to Danby.
He doesn't sell anymore, but that was his start, was selling products to Danby and Woods, which is the predecessor to Danby.
Wow, very interesting. So you have a whole bunch of mentors. Did you ever hire any of them in a formal sense, or were they all informal influencers in your life?
When I was at Cynics, they did hire a coach because, of course, you need a coach when you're at a larger company. So yes, I did hire them, and I also have hired personal trainers from time to time to
for exercise purposes?
For exercise, yeah, to get up my game.
Okay, good. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your relationship with your dad, because he wasn't such a fan of you starting your own business.
Right. I mean, my father passed away about 2 years ago, and he was my idol. But when I started the business, he said, oh, that's great. When it fails, you can always go get a real job. And my mother cried because her father had been in business through the Depression, had gone bankrupt, had fire and didn't believe in insurance, so had no fire insurance, like all kinds of bad things about being in business. And even 2 years after I was in business, I would come home for Christmas and Mom would say, so did you get a job yet? And like I was working 70 hours a week in my business, and it was kind of a job and I was profitable. But in the end, my father became a big advocate of this because he grew up in an era where you got a job and you worked there for life, and then you get a gold watch and a pension, and companies look after people. And then he saw what was happening in the end, that companies aren't necessarily for life. They're fleeting, and companies don't look after their people forever. That's not the current way.
So how did you respond? How did you deal with that? I mean, any young person who is starting out kind of wants the support of their parents. It's just, a natural thing. How did you deal with that opinion, that point of view, that, kind of lack of support, if you will?
Well, I actually think that made me successful. And the reason it made me successful is I would never quit, because I'm not going to go and tell them that it didn't work out. And early in business, you've got a lot of times when you're having problems making payroll and you're barely there, and you don't see the next sale or whatever. And so it actually was very inspirational and very driving to me. It was motivational.
So your pride forced you to keep going.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And what about those times when you could barely make payroll? Like, what made you, other than your parents, how did you pull it together? How did you figure it out? How did you make ends meet ultimately?
Largely, I did what all entrepreneurs do, and you just essentially figure it out. So I sometimes would get customers to pay me early, including very big customers, including universities, to pay me early by convincing them that they needed to pay me early. And I would convince suppliers that I would pay them late. And
how did you convince them? What line did you use? Because we all want to know that one.
Okay, so I'd owe a company $100,000, and I would send them a check for $3,000 with a note saying, I'll get you another payment next week. And then I'd send them a check next week, and I never dodged their calls. Check next week might be $3,000 or $5,000. And then they call. But at the end of the day, as long as I was giving them a little bit of money, and as long as I was honest with them, then they would go along with that. And the other thing is, I am somewhat old school, and those people who treated me well on the way up, I treat them very well today. So I'm not out, getting three prices and someone else is 8 cents cheaper, than you're out the door. I have businesses which I consider to be partners, and I'll treat them well forever.
And what about the people who were your clients and you convinced them to pay early? How did you do that one?
Well, if I could connect with a person, then most of the time people would pay. Companies don't pay, but people in companies will pay. Mm-hmm. And so I would be quite open sometimes, I recall, with the universities, because I'm selling to these professors, these people who are techie nerds that love the technology. And you just say, I'm a small business and I need to pay to buy this or buy the next thing. And do you think we'd get paid? And they didn't always, but often they would be able to short circuit it and put it through. And sometimes I would also give them incentive, not personal, but if you can pay me by the end of the month, we'll give you this next product $1,000 off or whatever, right?
I see. So let's say you had a group. Let's say you were teaching a class and the class was filled with I'd call them startup entrepreneurs who managed to get the ball rolling, and they were running businesses anywhere from, let's say, $1 million in revenue up to $10 million in revenue. And they asked one question. The question was, I want to increase my revenues. I want to, 2 times, 3 times, 10 times my revenues. What advice would you give them?
So I would look at where have they been successful and try to find clients that are substantially similar to where they've been successful. I also tend to like a market that is growing quickly, because a market that's growing quickly has more opportunity than not. One thing I often would do is go to a niche. So if I'm a smaller player in a large pond, then go be the niche player and only do certain small things. For instance, if you're a restaurant, don't be just a family restaurant. Be the best, I have no idea, the best baklava, meatball, be the meatball factory, right, where you're the best meatball, and say that you are, and then you become what you say you are, and you do become the best because you spent more time doing R&D on your meatballs that the competitors across the street haven't.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So whoever's listening, I hope you're taking notes, because this is pretty important. If you look back at your life, not just your career, but your life, what is perhaps one of the biggest areas of adversity that you've faced on a personal level?
Well, one of my biggest failures is I lost my first marriage. So I split with my first wife, and now I'm quite happy with the second wife. But at the end of the day, I did consider that to be a failure.
So the word lost is interesting. I lost my marriage.
Yes. I mean, I have always been very goal-driven and focused. And my mistake was I didn't put my wife on my goal list.
What does that mean? Is your wife a goal?
Well, you're asking a very good question. It does need to be on your priority list. Okay. Because I just assumed that that's naturally there, so don't worry about it. That gets looked after, and that doesn't happen. So it has to be on the list of priorities, but you're right, it's not a goal that gets accomplished like most of my other goals. And I think that's why, as a goal-focused person, I had more difficulty, and I guess at the time I didn't realize that needed to be on my goal list. But I certainly recognize it now, and I certainly, if I talk to any entrepreneurs, suggest that your relationships, and not just with your wife, with your parents, with your brothers, with your whatever, if you don't spend any time on them or invest at all, then you get the predicted result.
So, I coach a lot of very, very highly driven individuals. And what I have found over the past 14 years of coaching them is that they tend to make sacrifices on their way to success. So let me describe them, and I want to ask you if any of them resonate with you based on your experience. So the first sacrifice they make is that they feel very isolated, like they're in it alone. And I know you talked about micromanagement, but they tend to feel like if it's going to be done right, I've got to do it myself. Nobody really understands me. Nobody understands the hours, the time, the commitment that I'm making to this, and I've got to do this, and I'm focused, and nobody gets it, so I'm in this alone. The second one is that they have a lot of tension often in their relationships, whether it's personal or professional. And the reason they do is because those relationships become not the priority. They kind of fall by the wayside, and people in relationships with them don't understand why they operate the way they do, why they don't live their lives and work so hard and those kinds of things. The third one is that they feel very much like they are chronically dissatisfied. So what does that mean? It means like they've achieved a good goal, but they don't understand why they're not further ahead. So for example, if you find an entrepreneur who's bringing in $5 million in revenue, they don't understand why it's not 20 million. And so they're always feeling like they're behind the 8 ball and that they're trying really hard, paddling really, really hard to get ahead. And they feel like they're always at a disadvantage or never achieving what they think is possible for themselves. And last but not least, they let a lot of things slip through the cracks. they don't exercise, or they don't eat as well, or maybe they drink a lot, or maybe they don't have enough time for their friends or their family members, and they just let those important things slip through the cracks. And we find that's the case with a lot of highly driven entrepreneurs. Would you say any of those are reflective of your past experiences, especially as you talk about your first marriage?
Well, chronically dissatisfied is not a terrible trait for entrepreneurs. Because if you're not dissatisfied, then you're just going to go with the status quo. As soon as you go with the status quo, you're going to go out of business. So the dissatisfaction is not a bad trait. The letting your relationship go, that is the biggest problem that people do, because it's basically not realizing if you're going to do something more, you have to figure out what you're going to do less of. Because usually you can't do more of something. And a lot of people tend to take the time out of what they think is their free time, but it's not their free time. It's actually their relationship time. Mm-hmm. And even if it is their free time, they needed that free time, because you can't get to sleep by saying, oh, I'm going to be at 100 miles an hour and then I'm just going to stop and go to sleep. So many entrepreneurs, myself included, I would take it out of sleep and say, well, sleep's for wimps. I don't need to sleep. And I would just drive. But definitely it's easy to take it out of the relationship. As far as the feeling of being alone, that is part of the plight of the entrepreneur. And that's partly where mentors and coaches, I suppose, come in. I mean, one of the ways I would grow is when I was doing 10 million in sales, I would talk to people who were doing 30 million in sales. Then when I'm doing 30, talk to people doing 100, talk to people doing 200. So I just kept on going up. And I used to ask myself, okay, so when I'm doing $1 billion in sales, what will I be? Well, how will I have to change? And if you think about it, you can't do, if you're doing 5 million today and you want to do 20 million tomorrow, you will not be the person that's packing the boxes, or you're not going to be making the $2 sale. You're just not scalable. And going back to another comment about micromanagement, one of the reasons people micromanage is because of perfectionism, and more companies and more people fail from perfectionism than fail from speed. Mm. And we will drive ourselves crazy if I rewrite the handwritten note 8 times to make sure it's perfect. Does that really add much more value than just giving it the first one, if you know what I mean?
So you're always assessing ROI on the effort you're making.
I always try to, absolutely.
Interesting. Okay, so as we come around to the end of this interview, and it's been amazing, and I really do hope that people who are listening have been paying very close attention. You have a coach on the line, and one who works with a lot of the characters or the personalities that we've just been talking about. Is there a question that you have for this particular coach?
So I have 2 questions, one of which is probably tough or impossible, and one which is likely well within your wheelhouse. So I'll ask the tough one first, and that is, what should I do about tariffs? Because the playing field is changing every day. And this is a problem that I'm just facing, and I don't know what to do, where to invest, because it might not be a good investment tomorrow, and my investment time frames tend to be much longer term than changing on a dime.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting question, because obviously my area of expertise is looking at mindset and looking at how leaders think and how their thinking impacts their outcomes. And so I'm going to go back to, I don't know where you should invest. I'm not an investment genius. But what I will say is, when you were talking about your experience with the Syrian refugees, and you talked about picking up the phone and using your, let's call it clout, to open doors or make decisions or make things happen, I think that when you ask the question about tariffs, that may apply, which is, how do I get the right information from the right people, right? So I'm not the right person, right? But who are the right people, and how do I use, call it my notoriety, my success, my network, to get the information that I need? So that's part A. The second part about it that I would say to you is, and again, this, is so, this is something that's consuming your mind, your time, and I would ask you what part of it is in your control, right? And so there's a part of it that probably is in your control, in which case I would take action from there, but there's a part of it that isn't in your control. And then the question becomes, so given that it's not in control, how do I just mitigate my risk, right? And so half of it is, how do I use my thinking to create less stress, worry, and fear for myself? And the other part of it is, how do I leverage? You use the term leverage. How do I leverage my success, my resources, and my environment to become smarter about this subject, to have more insight, and to know how to navigate this strategically. So again, I'm not your resource on that, but I think if anyone's listening to this podcast and you're struggling with an issue, the first thing you want to do is really temper the emotions that cause you to feel out of sorts. And then the second one is say, what resources do I have that could help make this easier for me? And that would be like the approach. How does that sound?
That is outstanding, Kim. I thought that was a hardball. You really did that really well. I'm really impressed with that. So
coming from you, man, I take that as a huge compliment.
So I don't know whether to give you the softball, but the softball, I have found as I get older, I am finding I have less energy. Yeah. What tricks or suggestions would you have around energy?
Yeah, it's interesting. What I would do is I would pay attention to the patterns in your life. There are some things that fuel you and some things that drain you. And I would just start to pay attention to what those things are. And are you spending time in areas that fuel you and lift you? Just from a general, how do I experience things perspective, right? So that's not a physical answer, but that's a focus answer. So for me, if I have to sit down and listen to a conversation about technology and software development, I don't have any energy. But if you ask me a question about relationships, or if you ask me a question about business strategy, I have all the energy in the world for that. So you want to start to pay attention to what is fueling you and what is draining you, and then kind of take a little bit of a step back and say, am I spending my time in places that really fuel me, or am I giving away a lot of my time in places that drain me? So that's part A. Part B is the physical aspects. Am I getting enough sleep? Am I eating properly? Am I drinking enough water? Am I exercising in a good, healthy way? Am I taking some downtime? And am I working too hard or putting in too many hours? Am I taking some time for reflection and quiet? Because that stuff also can have a huge influence over your energy level. So those would be the two approaches that I would take when looking at your energy. And of course, make sure that you're eating nutritionally soundly and getting your blood tests done and all that other stuff, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so that's what I would do. But always, like for me, always my first approach is to look at how are we thinking about this, and how is our thinking impacting the emotional state that we find ourselves in. So at the beginning of this podcast, I said, your crown jewels are the way you feel. It's your emotional state, it's your mood, it's your disposition, and being exhausted or tired or drained is really connected to the mood. And so is there something happening in your environment that's draining you from a mood perspective? We need to look at that and address it.
Perfect. Excellent answer.
Yeah.
Excellent answer.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah. So Jim, thank you so much for spending this time with me. It was an absolute pleasure. I learned quite a bit, and it made me think about my own business, my coaching business, and how I could start to grow, and some of the ideas that you gave. And I'm going to go tomorrow and implement them right away. And so thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, and your years of experience.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.